Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often, it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
Each bit of information delivers that to the whole jigsaw.
I was able to test that sample and I got a DNA profile.
There's no doubt at all that forensics were absolutely crucial in this case.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science were able to bring some of our most dangerous and despicable killers to justice.
This was such an unnatural crime.
It's not a question of if he will kill again, it's a question of when.
He believed that he was invincible and that nothing could stop him.
We'll hear how some of the toughest and most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
When you begin a forensic investigation, you don't know what you're going to find.
The officer plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
From the type of insects that were around, she'd been dead for at least 5 years.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man.
In this episode, a young woman's murderer eludes capture for decades.
The community just went into shock.
But it's a case detectives refuse to let lie.
You hear of people talk about old cases being closed. They're never closed.
And a revolutionary forensic technique allows them to finally trace the killer.
So there we had it the first time. Now we've got a possible name of a possible offender.
This is forensics, catching the killer.
This village, just on the south of Nottingham, mixed development, council estates, some quite posh houses, mixture of commuters, professional people, working people.
In 1983, Keyworth was a small, normal village few people outside of South Nottinghamshire would have heard of. But the events on the night of 30th October would change that forever.
This whole community is just taken over by the police activity, by the media activity, by the attention, and it tends to send a community like that into shock.
That shock was caused by the disappearance of 16-year-old trainee hairdresser Colette Aram. Rod Chater, a newspaper reporter covering the Midlands patch in the early 80s, remembers the story breaking.
This is, you know, a respectable, nice kid next door, and something absolutely terrible has happened to her. The story that emerged from the police was that Colette had gone to see her boyfriend the previous night, and in one of those twists, and there always does seem to be one of those tragic twists, in a sense it shouldn't have happened, because under normal circumstances her boyfriend would have collected her and driven her the 1.5 miles to his house, but his car was off the road. 8 o'clock at night, late October, it's dark, but she sees some friends at about 8:10, passes a word with them, turns, and moments later, they and others hear terrible screams, female screams. The police think, everybody thinks those witnesses heard her being abducted. Some stories just do penetrate the national psyche. They just bury themselves in the national consciousness, and they just become huge. Reporters descending on the area, national reporters, TV crews, everybody, I mean, you just know You just do know when it's a big tale, and this was clearly going to be a big tale, and everything that developed after that reinforced that.
In the early 1980s, the memories of the Yorkshire Ripper still hung over the country. Could something similar have happened in sleepy Keyworth? In less than 24 hours, the friends, family and police officers now searching for Colette would have their answer. Kevin Flint was a young detective sergeant with Nottinghamshire Constabulary at the time Colette disappeared.
So on the Monday morning, there was a local man who was driving from Keyworth towards Walsall at about 9 o'clock in the morning. And as he travelled along Thirlby Lane, he saw Colette's body lying in the field. It was about 150 yards into the field. The clothing from Colette was found in the ditch, which was very nearby. They attended and quickly realised it was a crime scene and placed a small cordon at the edge of the field to prevent members of the public from entering into the field. So the scene was effectively secured very early on.
Colette's body was found just over 3 kilometres from her home. A forensic pathologist's post-mortem would conclude she'd been sexually assaulted and strangled. As part of the examination, semen from the killer is recovered and stored.
The community of Keyworth just went into shock. Every family's nightmare that a family member just disappears off the face of the earth.
So on the Monday morning when Colette's body had been found, as soon as possible the investigation would seek information from the public. So very early on there would be a local press release, and there was indeed a national press release. So the community in Keyworth would quickly know what had happened, and that understandably would cause concern to the local community, because they're in fear that this man is living amongst them and may well strike again. So yes, there was a fair amount of tension and trepidation at that time.
The house-to-house inquiries would provide a vital clue about the car heard speeding off shortly after the last known sighting of Colette.
So what we now know is that the vehicle, the red Ford Fiesta, was stolen at about 4:30, because the owner of the vehicle saw the vehicle being driven away. We know it entered Keyworth at about 4:45, so some 15 minutes later, the red Ford Fiesta was sighted in Keyworth. And then, not long after that, the vehicle was seen parked up on Mount Pleasant in Keyworth. The vehicle remained there for some time.
There were multiple sightings of him all round the village for a couple of hours. And he'd stopped and approached women, a 17-year-old girl and a schoolgirl, at least, spuriously asking for directions, clearly engaging with women in some way, looking for something. This seemed to fit a pattern that the police could chase up and follow. It seemed the best lead.
A nationwide hunt was now launched to find the mysterious man in the red Fiesta, a man who police believed to be Colette's killer. In October 1983, police had launched a manhunt after the body of a 16-year-old girl had been found in a field near the town of Keyworth, Nottinghamshire. Colette Aram had been abducted, sexually assaulted and strangled. So far, the best lead detectives hunting for her killer had was a mysterious man driving a distinctive red Ford Fiesta.
The vehicle was in the area of Keyworth for a number of hours whilst he was trying to find his victim.
The car would later be found abandoned, but there was vital forensic evidence at the scene that linked the red Fiesta to the murder.
So we think the car that was used to abduct Colette obviously was the red Fiesta that came down Thirlby Lane, turned off the road about 1.5 miles out of Keyworth, behind the hedgerow, and we know that Colette was found at about 150 yards into the field, and the police discovered tyre tracks leading into and away from the field, and the vehicle that we think left those tracks was the red Ford Fiesta that was found on Mount Pleasant during the investigation.
Blood was also found in the car and swabs taken, and soon detectives had more crucial information about the man in the red Fiesta. The description of him given by one of the girls he approached earlier on the night Colette vanished allowed police to create a photo fit of their prime suspect.
And when she saw the likeness of the photo fit, she was actually physically sick. She obviously had seen the man that had taken Colette. Well, she obviously thought that she could have been the victim, and sadly Colette was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she'd been extremely lucky to avoid being captured by this man, an hour or so earlier.
By now, the story had gone national.
I think that post-Yorkshire Ripper era, there was an awareness, a greater awareness in the country that there were individuals out there who were capable of roaming around the country, as it were, and all concentrating on a particular geographical area and carrying out horrendous attacks on women. And there was a deeper awareness of that, and in a sense, a bit of a fear of that. Within 48 hours, they'd got a really good lead. The landlady of the Generous Britain pub in nearby Costock had a customer in, a client in, on that night. He'd ordered a pint of orange juice and lemonade and a ploughman's cheese roll.
The detectives went to see her and took a statement from her, and she recollected this man said he wasn't local, that he'd come off the motorway at the wrong junction, but she also noticed that he got blood on his hands. She thinks that the man saw her looking at his hands. He asked where the toilet was. He went to the toilet. So she recollected this account to the detectives that went, and they went to the gents' toilets, and lo and behold, there was a bin, and they recovered the tissues that apparently had got blood staining on the tissues.
The quick thinking of detectives had secured a vital piece of forensic evidence that could belong to the killer. There was only one issue. The science to extract vital genetic information from the tissue didn't exist. So investigators would have to rely on old-fashioned police work to try to identify their suspect through witness statements and house-to-house inquiries.
There was a process of trying to eliminate those and establish where those individuals were at the material time. So that was a key part of the investigation. And latterly, when the case was looked at, there were over 900 persons of interest in the system. So it was a massive undertaking.
By mid-November, detectives received some new information. But this isn't from a member of the public. Chillingly, it's direct from Colette's killer.
An anonymous letter was received purporting to have been written by the offender, saying it was Halloween, I was wearing a mask, you won't catch me, and I've left the area. And to prove that it was me, was she wearing a blouse? At the time, the fact that Colette's blouse had been tied around one of her wrists and was still on her body, that wasn't publicised by the investigation teams.
He's taunting them about their failure to find him. The police kind of have to release it and want to release it, but they're aware that it doesn't make them look in a good light at all. And then we get this uneasy relationship between the police and the media. And the message will be, well, no, they haven't solved it. Well, yes, they did get off to a great start, and it did look extremely promising just 2 weeks ago, but they haven't cracked it.
While it may have taunted the officers searching for the killer, it also offered them forensic evidence that could help catch him.
It was forensically examined, but there were finger marks found on the letter, and those finger marks were used to try and eliminate people from the inquiry. 900 people that had been put forward, so they were being traced and their movements looked at, their fingerprints checked against the letter, and enquiries done into the background of these individuals. So that was the thrust of the inquiry for some considerable time.
But the fingerprints left on the letter didn't lead to a suspect. Neither did a national TV appeal.
So the suspicion may have begun to be planted in people's mind that maybe this Colette case was a similar case to the Ripper, where someone was apparently above the law and capable of deceiving the police on multiple occasions, getting away with crime after crime after crime and taunting them about it, which almost encouraged their own behaviour to go out and do it again. Was this killer going to go out and do it again?
But rather than strike again, it seemed that Colette's killer would simply vanish into thin air. And by April 1984, the inquiry into Colette Aram's murder was quietly wound down.
Well, a case such as this, it's demoralising for not only the detectives working on the case, but the policing community right throughout Nottinghamshire and the local community. Whilst ever this person had not been caught, had they committed other offences.
New reports through the 1980s would highlight that Colette's murder wasn't an isolated incident in Britain at the time. In the 3 years that followed Colette's murder, schoolgirl Melanie Rode in Bristol and then Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth in Leicestershire were all victims of sexual killers. These were unrelated to Colette's case, but like hers, would remain unsolved for years as the murderers carried on their lives.
It was always in the psyche of the police and the local community, was this man still out there?
12 years after Colette's murder, DNA fingerprinting was now a vital tool in the forensic armoury of detectives.
In 1995, the law was changed so that people who had been arrested for a recordable offence could have DNA taken from them as a matter of course. And very quickly, the national DNA database grew so that in 1997, there were effectively millions of people on it.
It was also being used to examine evidence in cold cases. Dr. Tim Clayton, then based at the Forensic Science Service Lab in Wetherby, West Yorkshire, was part of the service's cold case team.
I was allocated the case in 1997, which came in just as a simple review. It was, this is an undetected murder and we'd like to do some more DNA tests. I was sent a microscope slide and that was made originally in 1983 from one of the intimate swabs that had been taken from Colette's body at the forensic post-mortem in 1983. And this is like a mini time capsule because secure and safe away from the environment under that glue is a little spot of cells from the original offence, and those cells contain DNA, and if we can get at that DNA, then we can raise a DNA profile, and if we can get a DNA profile, then we can challenge the national DNA database.
14 years after Colette was brutally murdered as she walked to her boyfriend's house, Could advances in forensic science finally reveal who the killer was? In Nottinghamshire, police investigating the vicious murder of teenager Colette Aram in 1983 were hoping advances in forensic science and DNA might finally trap her killer. 14 years after the murder, Dr. Tim Clayton from the Forensic Science Service was hoping a fragment of paper tissue recovered from the Generous Britain pub could reveal the killer's identity.
I subjected that to DNA tests, the ones that we'd got at the time in 1997, and I got what we call in the trade a partial profile. In other words, a full DNA profile back then would have consisted of 20 elements, and I found 3. Although we had obtained a little bit of genetic information about the offender, we were a long way away from having his full DNA profile.
Despite the advances in science, it seemed once again that Colette's killer would evade capture. "22 years after the murder in Keyworth, Kevin Flint, now a detective superintendent, is past the cold case file on Colette Aram.
You hear of people talk about old cases being closed. They're never closed. There's always someone responsible. There's always a senior investigating officer dedicated to an undetected case such as this. So these cases are never closed.
A public appeal on the 20th anniversary had produced 300 new leads. Armed with these and the evidence from the original inquiry, Kevin once again began to investigate the murder of Colette.
And one of the key things that, in tandem with looking at the 300 calls, we decided to look what we might be able to do forensically. We had blood samples from Colette's blouse, we had intimate samples that had been examined in '97 with a limited result, and we had the blouse and we had the bloodstained tissue. Well, we knew the bloodstained tissue had got semen on.
And while the first cold case review had provided investigators with only a partial DNA match, now a new test had been developed that would prove a game changer. It was called low copy number testing.
So it was the same DNA profiling test that I'd used in 1997, but it had been made super sensitive. In other words, it could target smaller amounts of DNA. Not only we'd got material that we could go back at, but I'd also got better tools in my toolbox. So was I encouraged? Yes, I thought we had a shot at this.
Dr. Clayton's DNA deep dive started with a slide containing material taken from the seat of the red Ford Fiesta, driven by the killer.
And when I tested that, that was a blood stain that they were looking for. Initially made the slide to try and find semen, but there wasn't any. But when I tested that blood stain, I got a full DNA profile matching Colette. And so that was the first time we'd had proof positive that Colette had been inside the Ford Fiesta and bleeding. So that was the first real piece of success.
Establishing the car's connection to Colette was one thing. Now they needed to identify the killer. Once again, Dr. Clayton would return to the paper towel found in the Generous Britain pub.
When I looked at the results of those tests, several of them showed mixtures of DNA between Colette and an unknown male.
A single clean sample of the man's DNA was also collected, which matched semen swabs taken from Colette's body during the post-mortem examination.
And so the circle was completed. We'd now linked Colette to the car to the scene to the Generous Britain, and our man to the paper towel in the Generous Britain. And so the question was, who was this male?
It was a massive break for Kevin Flint's cold case team, who now hoped that a matching profile would exist on the National DNA Database. The database contains the record of any person convicted of an offence since 1995, from minor crimes to more serious offences.
It's just a natural reaction that you imagine, you suspect, that the person who's committed such an horrific crime will have committed other offences, may well be on the national database for committing something.
That night I arranged for it to be loaded to the National DNA Database, and then we sat there with bated breath waiting for the results to come back. Within a very short space of time the results were back, and our moment of euphoria was dashed completely because it came back as negative. In other words, there were no matching subject records on the National DNA Database.
We're crestfallen. I assumed that someone who'd committed such an horrendous crime as this will be on the National DNA Database, and lo and behold, they weren't.
It is one of the most frustrating things in forensic science to have the DNA profile of what you believe to be the offender. You've got an extremely sharp tool. You can eliminate practically everybody in the world, but somehow you've got to get to that person, to take a swab from them, to compare them.
The forensic breakthrough the cold case team had banked on hadn't happened, and the chances of identifying Colette's killer seemed to be ebbing away.
The question now falls, well, do we just leave the DNA profile sat on the database and hope that the offender will one day come on to the national database? Or do we actually now begin to start doing investigative work to try and identify new suspects and nominals? And in fact, that's what the team decided.
Police profiling suggested the offender might still live locally, so an operation began to swab as many men as possible in the Keyworth area.
And so one by one people were asked for voluntary swabs, and they gave them, and one by one they were eliminated. So day by day, hour by hour, month by month, we gradually got through and eliminated lots of people. There were occasionally people in there who looked potentially like they might be the offender, but the DNA test proved otherwise.
In total, more than 5,000 men were tested and eliminated from the inquiry. Despite the forensic profile, police still couldn't directly identify Colette's killer. The key to unlocking the murder of the schoolgirl 25 years ago would unbelievably come courtesy of a beloved elderly lady called Gladys Godfrey.
Gladys was well known in the community. She used to stand on her walker outside her front door and wave at the kids going to school and coming back from school. She was a really lovely person. The Ladybrook estate in Mansfield is a really close-knit community. There's lots of residential streets, and Gladys's bungalow, where she lived, there's a club opposite it where people would go and socialise and have drinks. And so there was lots of people in the area coming and going that knew Gladys, that would recognise Gladys, and she was one of their own, one of the people that was important in that community.
But in 2001, this close-knit community was shocked when Gladys was targeted by a burglar.
Someone entered her property, attacked her, but she managed to fight him off with a lemonade bottle, and she scratched him. She pulled his earring out. And that just shows what type of person that she was, that even though that she was so small, she was under 5 foot, she weighed just 6 stone.
Forensics recovered a DNA profile of the attacker, but a search of the national database failed to provide a match. And then a year later, Gladys was targeted again, and this time the feisty lady hadn't managed to fight off her attacker.
From what we know of that night, we know the attack was brutal. We know that Gladys was dragged from the living room into the bedroom, which is where she was found by police. And the police have said it's one of the most brutal killings that they've ever experienced.
The forensic evidence recovered from Gladys's murder would shock investigators.
But it was established by the scientists that the partial profile from the previous attack matched our current profile, so we knew the attacker had come back and sexually assaulted Gladys and killed Gladys. So we knew we got the same man. What we had was a description, a physical description of Gladys's murderer, because Gladys had made a statement about her attack and she described him as a white male in his early 20s with dark hair.
Police had a description and a DNA profile, but once again, a database search drew blanks. But Kevin and his team were prepared to use a new DNA profiling technique that was emerging. Familial DNA allows investigators to identify close relatives of a potential offender, which in turn could lead them to their suspect.
And the people that were of interest at the top of the list, either the parent-child or the sibling list, we would then draw up a family tree and visit the males of interest and eliminate them from the inquiry. And that's what we did on the Gladys inquiry.
They went into the community. The police were asking all men in the local area to give their DNA, and they took over 1,000 swabs. People were willing to come forward. They wanted for this killer to be caught because it meant something in their community. They were not going to let this person go free.
It took several months of swabbing and testing, but soon there were several positive hits based on the number of alleles, a gene variant that matched the original samples from the killer.
So we had a family with 15 alleles in Manchester, we had a family in Mansfield with 14 alleles, and then we had a family in Mansfield with 13 alleles, and that was the family of Ward. There was the mother, the father, and two sons who lived at the family address.
Further tests would finally pinpoint their suspect.
They tracked him down to a plastics factory that he worked at in the area, and that's where the police arrested Jason Ward, who was 22 at the time, and the community were shocked that such a young man could rape and murder an 87-year-old woman.
The familial DNA technique came online, and within 3 months of us utilising that tool, we'd got a man. This case was the first homicide, the first murder case where someone was convicted utilising familial DNA.
Gladys's case was a landmark moment. Could familial DNA now hold the key to another of Kevin's murder cases? "22 years since teenage hairdresser Colette Aram was murdered in the small Nottinghamshire town of Keyworth. Cold case detectives are hoping forensic science will finally bring her killer to justice. They hoped a familial DNA testing program, where a relative's profile would closely match that of their suspect, would help trace the man who savagely murdered the 16-year-old in 1983.
All that generated a list of 272 what we call nominals. In other words, these are people who could be related to the offender, but could not be the offender. So the question was, who are these people and who are their relatives? And bit by bit, we worked our way through that 272 nominal list and managed to exclude every single person on it. We double-checked, cross-checked, and at the end of the day, having made all those checks and done everything, we had failed to find a potential family member of the offender.
Almost 3 years since the Cold Case Review began re-examining Colette's murder, once again, investigators look to be at a dead end.
Science has advanced to the point which should lead them to the killer. And so they run it through this ever-growing national database, and guess what? It's another 2 steps forward and 1 step back. They've got the DNA, it doesn't match anything on the database. And that must have been a hammer blow.
To be honest with you, I was pretty well out of ideas at that point. But just as a last comment almost, I just said, well, it has taken us 18 months to do all the familial searching. I guess there's a small possibility that a relative of the offender could come on the database in the 18 months that we've been doing all this work. I think it's a bit of a long shot, but it's easy to do.
Amongst those was a local man who'd actually been sampled in the June of that year, so luckily for us had only just gone onto the National DNA database.
Could this be the breakthrough the Cold Case team need to solve the case?
They arrest a young man on a minor motoring offence. He is DNA swabbed routinely. The new DNA sample was from a young man called John Paul Hutchinson, 20 years old, clearly not the killer, but they start to investigate his family, and they look at his father. The father is one of 4 brothers. There are other relatives, but police now intensively look at this family.
One of the brothers had recently died, but police would obtain forensic samples from the remaining 3 relatives to see if their DNA matched that of Colette's killer.
They were brought into custody, they were interviewed. 2 of the brothers spoke freely and gave their accounts of the recollection of the events and where they were in 1983, fully cooperated, gave their fingerprints, gave their DNA. Paul Hutchinson was interviewed and went no comment. Throughout a series of interviews, gave his DNA, gave his fingerprints.
Paul Hutchinson's demeanour during questioning aroused suspicions. But would the forensic tests confirm he was indeed the man detectives had been hunting for more than a quarter of a century?
And we did them in very short order, and the 2 uncles were positively eliminated. The one that was taken from, now we know to be Paul Hutchinson, was a full match to the Generous Britain paper towel.
The familial DNA link from his son who committed the motoring offence wasn't the only forensic evidence that connected Paul Hutchinson to the murder.
I received a telephone call from the fingerprint officers to say that they'd establish Paul Hutchinson's fingerprints on the anonymous letter. Ironically, above the words, "got me caught."
But the question remained, where had Paul Hutchinson been for so long, and how had he managed to evade capture?
In 25 years, in the intervening period between the killing and his eventual arrest, he'd become something close to a pillar of the community.
But when questioned about the brutal rape and murder, Hutchinson offered no real explanation for his actions.
When he was finally arrested, there were 2 sentences that he said to police ever, really, about this case. I'll tell you all I can, but I can't remember much. It's like a dream. And that almost, you know, has the ring of truth about it. It would seem a one-off episode in his life where he just completely became another person, lost control, came out of himself and committed this terrible, terrible crime.
For over 2 decades, the man now suspected of killing Colette had been living in plain sight, even being questioned by police as part of the original house-to-house inquiries.
And what they find is that Paul Hutchinson was living 7 streets away from Colette at the time of the murder. He was absolutely on the spot. Interestingly, he shaved his head around the murder, changed his appearance, disappeared, said he was going for lung cancer treatment.
But we established that he'd never had cancer, he'd not had a lung removed, and it was a ruse that he portrayed to his family and to the police to effectively get away with this. The man was an inveterate liar.
But this wouldn't be the final deception Paul Hutchinson would attempt. Something Dr. Tim Clayton had worried about since the arrest.
First thing that sprung into my mind was, I wonder if he's going to blame his dead brother.
He said that they'd gone out to commit a burglary that evening when they'd used the car, and that he'd decided that Paul had decided he couldn't commit the offence, and he'd left his brother with the car, and his brother must have committed the offence.
Thankfully, forensics were able to disprove Hutchinson's last-ditch defence.
And I was able to test that sample, and I got a DNA profile, and I was able to conclusively prove that whilst it was part of the same family, this individual, albeit he was deceased, could not have been the offender. So at that point, we had ruled out all 3 brothers.
But what we obviously knew was that it was Paul's fingerprints on the anonymous letter. That didn't prove the murder, but his full profile on the tissue obviously clearly was significant evidence. But we'd established a profile of his dead brother, and that didn't match the profile.
Thanks to the advances in forensic science, detectives could finally get justice for Colette.
This is at Nottingham Crown Court. Mr. Justice Flo, passing sentence. It was a truly horrendous attack, violent, twisted and perverted. It was a terrible act which has torn Colette's family apart and left a community haunted. The killing was clearly premeditated. You concealed your guilt for 25 years and only pleaded guilty when the evidence became overwhelming. The terror and degradation that this poor girl must have suffered at the hands of a stranger in her last moments are unimaginable. You have lived your life with your wife and children who were completely ignorant of who you were. And then, as Hutchinson just looked vacantly at the family, the judge told him he was recommending him for a tariff of 25 years. Take him down.
Superintendent Kevin Flint, who worked on the original investigation nearly 3 decades earlier, was now able to close the case that had dogged him almost all his career.
It's just fantastic. It's what you've strived for the family, for the policing community, the people that had tried to solve this case over many years, for the scientists, now that science had advanced so well, they worked tirelessly. You know, hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands of people over the years had worked on a case such as this.
There's a little adage in forensic science about you need a lucky break. We were unlucky that the person we were seeking wasn't on the National DNA database, but then lucky that between the first and the second familial searches, a relative of that person was added to the database. And I think that was the key. Without that piece of, that stroke of luck, that the timings were just right, and at that point we knew we'd caught the killer.